Welcome to our podcast, A Novel Talk. Your co-hosts are Carl Lee and I'm Wendy Kendall. I write cozy mysteries, and after the fun I had co-hosting the Kendall and Cooper Talk Mysteries podcast series, now I'm so excited to branch out into all sorts of genres, talking with authors about their novels. And now to your co-host.
Hi, my name is Carl Lee. I write paranormal fantasy, and I'm excited that Wendy invited me to join her as we explore genres beyond mystery, sci-fi, fantasy, and paranormal. Our first guest is Gerri Russell. Is your heart set on romantic adventure? Well, we have the author for you. Gerri has done it all when it comes to writing. She's worked as a broadcast journalist, newspaper reporter, magazine columnist, technical writer and editor, instructional designer, and which all led her finally to follow her heart's desire of being a romantic novelist. Gerri is an award-winning, best-selling author of 13 novels and 1 novella. Enjoy her adventurous and emotionally intense novels set in the 12th century to the 17th century Scotland, and her fun and flirty contemporary novels set in the Pacific Northwest. A 2-time recipient of the Romance Writers of America's Golden Heart Award and winner of American Title II competition sponsored by RT Book Review magazine. Welcome, Gerri Russell.
Thanks, Wendy and Carl, for having me as a guest today. I'm really excited to be here and to share a bit about writing and reading historical romances with your listeners.
Oh, goody! We're really excited. A Novel Talk with Gerri Russell. Congratulations on your most recent book, 7 Nights with a Scot. It was thrilling, heart-racing, 7 nights of wonderful romantic adventure, I can tell you. In your blog on your website, gerrirussell.net. I encourage all listeners to visit your fun website, by the way. You write about your inspiration for this historical All the Kingsmen series. You call it a what if moment. Could you share that inspiration now with our listeners and that spark that pushes authors to jump in with both feet?
I'd love to. Every book is special, but for me, the All the Kingsmen series really came from a place in my heart. The idea for the series came during a trip to Scotland when I was walking up Edinburgh Castle's esplanade and saw a monument that's called the Witches' Well. It marks a location where over 300 women were burned at the stake as witches. It's really difficult to walk past a marker like that and not stop and think about the people whose lives ended right there in that very spot. I wanted to know more about those women, about their lives, and I just knew there was a wonderful story there, a story that could help people remember what happened, but also would celebrate the lives of those women who were caught up in the burning times. That's where my what if moment started and became that.
It's heart-wrenching thinking about, the witches and the accusations. Wow.
Yeah, it was pretty sad, and we'll get into more about who was burned and why, but it's just really an interesting time in history.
That was a romance novel? I thought it was an action-adventure novel. It was amazing. It's a little intimidating for us to interview a successful journalist such as yourself. What skills did you learn as a journalist that are also tools you use in your novel writing?
Well, as a journalist, you learn to ask questions. You try to see things a little differently and from different points of view than are your own. And you need to ask those all-important questions: who, what, why, where, when, how. But you also need to think about motivating factors, influences on people and places and things. Those are exactly the same skills that you need to be a novelist, no matter what genre you write. Now, the important thing to remember when you're writing a novel, though, is that you are not your characters. And you have to be able to imagine how they might talk and move and react in everyday and extraordinary situations. For instance, I've never been a male warrior. But in order to make Quinn, my hero in Seven Nights at the Scot, seem real to readers, I had to know everything about his present, his past, and his future, and a fair amount about weapons and battle techniques in the 16th century in order to really make him come alive on the page. It was a very fun experience.
Well, he definitely came alive on the page.
Yeah, it was very exciting. All the sword play and everything, that was very exciting.
Well, it has to be realistic.
Your protagonist in Seven Nights with a Scot is Vivian. And at one point in their dangerous journey to the castle refuge, she says, quote, "I don't fear being different as much as I fear not using my gifts for good. We all have special gifts, every one of us." And that's the end of the quote. And the incredible Scot says to her, quote, "You're not like other women," which Vivian thinks about and decides that sounded more like a compliment than a reproach. Your characters are so memorable and inspiring. What's important in character development, especially for main characters? And can you tell our listeners your favorite characteristic of Vivian and of Quinn, the Scot?
Sure. Yes. Well, characters are what make a book. And so it's really important to really focus on those people. But in order to kind of explain Vivian and Quinn a little bit, I need to backtrack and tell you a little bit about Scottish history at this point. The North Berwick witch trials were the very first trials in Scotland. And there were lots that followed, that spilled over to England, and they claimed thousands, up to 7,000 lives between the 14th century and the 18th century, But each book in the series focuses on a different aspect of those witch trials. So in Seven Nights at the Scot, my main character, Vivian Sinclair, she's a healer, but she also has the gift of precognition, which means she has visions. So Vivian, in that period of history, represented many women who had healing knowledge and passed it down from generation to generation. And these healers were such a vital importance to a village's health and welfare. And then all of a sudden, anybody who had that skill was looked on with suspicion and in fear in the political climate and societal and religious unrest during the time. And King James was the big fanner of these witch fever flames, because he was very superstitious and he just saw witches in every corner. And he encouraged religious leaders and civic leaders to find and seek out anybody who was different or suspected of being what he called agents of Satan, which meant anybody who was old, poor, ill, mentally ill, widowed, a cook, a healer, a spinster, a nonconformist, a bad housekeeper, ill-tempered, foul-mouthed, too pretty, had a vivid imagination, or was outspoken in any way, could be accused of witchcraft.
Oh, my God.
And just think about that. How well would you fare?
Not very. I hit many of those targets.
I love if you were a cook, because you could slip potions into people's foods, or if you were a bad housekeeper, it's like, what was that about? But, these women, once they were accused, they were tortured and tried. And, if they were lucky, they were branded and then banished. But then again, that was a death sentence as well, because you couldn't belong to a village with a brand on your face. And they were either hanged or burned at the stake. And the really most unfortunate ones were just burned alive.
So cruel.
But there's nothing, it was very much so. But I love being a novelist and being able to bring history alive with characters that readers can identify with. And Vivian, she doesn't have a great situation. People are out to get her. Nothing looks promising for her. And she desperately needs a hero warrior to protect her from harm. And she finds that in Quinn Douglas, who's the hero of the book. And as the title makes clear, Vivian and Quinn spend 7 adventurous nights together in the wilds of Scotland. Their goal is to stay alive and to stay a step ahead of the witch hunter that's after them until they reach the safety of the Douglas stronghold. And throughout the book, I think my favorite characteristics of both Vivian and Quinn are how resilient and determined they are to be what the other needs during the highs and lows of the story. And it's very reflective of real life. When we encounter difficulties, we often learn about ourselves and discover who we can lean on when we're at our most vulnerable. And I think the book really showed that.
Yes, beautifully it does.
Yeah, definitely. Gerri, you talked about bringing your characters to life, giving them vitality. One of the ways you did that was through their manners of speech. I knew who was speaking throughout the book, just by their choice of words. What is the secret of creating effective dialogue and especially creating effective character accents?
It's tricky. Again, it goes back to character, and you have to really look at their personalities and figure out how they're going to talk. And of course, the hardest part for me is I am not a male, and so it's hard to write male speak. So a lot of times I write it out and I have to go back and edit out the touchy-feely type things, according to the character. But, writing character dialogue and dialect is a balancing act. It's really tricky because you have to make a book either historically or regionally accurate while making the words accessible to the reader. So I can't write in Old English, Scottish, words because no one would understand them.
Right.
So whether you're using a Southern drawl or a Scottish brogue, it's important to use dialect lightly so that it sets the stage, but it doesn't overwhelm the narrative.
Yes, you definitely have a deft hand. Sorry.
Yeah. Well, and a lot of times I use the actual brogue type words for my secondary characters because it's just a little bit easier. I call it brogue light.
I like it.
Then I toss in some Gaelic and Celtic phrases, but those kind of things are more setting than actual dialogue or dialect.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Well, Gerri, when your characters, Vivian, Quinn, and their little group, their little band, as they're wandering together, at one point they visit the abbey, and the abbess Catherine, who notes that a merciful God allows you to choose from a variety of paths he's laid out before you, each with a different outcome. That made me wonder, for plot development, who is it that chooses the paths? Is it the characters or is it the author?
That's a great question. My characters always choose their own paths, no matter whether I have a plan in mind or not. When I start a book, I have a basic plot in mind, but really none of the details. And I just start writing, and I let the characters guide me along the way. It's their book. I put them in terrible situations, and it's up to them to figure out a way out. But I admit the best part of writing romantic fiction is that there's always a happy ever after, every single time.
Nice. That's really something, though. I mean, you can write yourself into, or you can write these characters into situations, and then, I mean, you don't know. I mean, you're just going in blind, right?
Yep. Well, towards the end of the book of 7 Nights with the Scot, Vivian gets into some trouble, and I'm like, how am I going to fix this? I don't have to fix this. Quinn has to fix this.
That's cool.
That's great. Yeah. So the villainous Rupert is certainly a terrifying threat. Very exciting tension he creates. Only when he's inflicted pain on others or observes their raw emotions that he felt a surge of satisfaction with himself. His quest would end soon. 'Twas the drawback of hunting his prey. He always caught what he sought. I love that quote from the book. What is the importance of creating a bad guy in your stories?
Well, conflict is important in stories, and every story needs a villain. The villain doesn't have to be a person. It can be something or someone, but they have to keep your characters from achieving their goal. It's the conflict that makes a book exciting and keeps readers reading. So whatever it is that you come up with, there has to be something that kind of gets in the way of them getting what they want or making things worse.
When you're developing your bad guy, is there do you develop that character differently than you do any other character, or do you kind of go through the same process?
The same process. They have to have a complete character arc. They have to have a past, a present, a future. They have to have goals. They have to have motivations. And for me, it's really important to give them some redeeming factor somewhere.
Oh. Well, I have to say that your intimate scenes are very well written, breathtaking, I might say. What's most important for a well-written intimate scene? Not only in the scene itself, but in the lead up to it and then the after scene.
Sure. Well, just like the rest of a novel, a love scene needs to have conflict and tension, and usually between two people. It has to have felt love or forbidden love or an impossible expression of their feelings for each other. Restraint and tension are the name of the game when it comes to love scenes or sexual tension. Flirtation, intrigue, wooing, and resistance are more important than the actual act of the two characters coming together. It's also important to remember that in real life, people rarely say exactly what they feel, particularly when they feel vulnerable. They might mask emotions, speak insincerely, or skirt around what they really mean or come at it sideways. Your story should reflect this human behavior. Romance happens in the space between attraction and fulfillment. The longer you spread out that space, the more romance your scene or your story becomes. Give your characters a believable reason to fall in love and build it slowly. Let it build to that long-awaited moment and delay. The more you delay the fulfillment, the deeper your story becomes.
Okay.
That's excellent. I never thought of it that way. Speaking of delayed fulfillment, can you give us a little preview of what's coming up in this series, coming up in the next installment?
Sure. Well, you don't have to wait very long for the second book in the All the Kingsmen series. Romancing the Laird, featuring Quinn's twin brother, Reed, releases next week on April 30th and is available at all retailers. I'm currently writing the third book in the series called Temptress in Tartan, which will be an August 2019 release.
Is Reed going to recover from his heartbreak of missing getting Vivian taken from him?
You're just going to have to read the next book to find out.
Ah! Well, speaking of reading, I was wondering, Gerri, if you'd be willing to treat our listeners to a sample of your most recent novel, 7 Nights with a Scot.
Sure. Was the dark stranger nearby? He obviously hadn't taken her to any of the makeshift jails that had been set up across the country for those accused of witchcraft. She'd heard enough whispers about those places to know they were nothing like where she was now. Where exactly was she? Nerves jittering in the pit of her stomach, Vivian slipped off the mattress. Once she was certain her legs would hold solid despite the laudanum she'd been given, she moved to the window. Pushing the shutters aside, she peered into the darkness. Moonlight spilled across the muddy streets of the village she knew all too well, painting Kilkieran in an eerie light. Muffled in the shadows below her window, she could hear the men's voices, yet she couldn't make out what they said. In the distance, she heard the familiar roar of the waves slamming against the cliffs near the castle. She knew this place. The stranger had taken her to the old crossing coaching inn, just at the edge of the village. The very thought of Rupert was nearby sent her heart into a fast-paced rhythm. Was he behind this? Did the stark stranger work for the new laird of the Campbell clan? Closing the shutters, Vivian turned and crept toward the door. She wasn't as interested in the answers to her questions as she was in escaping her current situation. Twice this day she'd put herself in danger, refusing to leave Kilkieran before Dougald had died, and again when a little boy was life was at stake. It was time to put her own needs first. She had to leave before she found herself in an inescapable situation. Silently, she pressed the latch down. The door cracked open. A sliver of light distorted her vision. Once her eyes adjusted to the flickering light, she could see the hallway was empty. She opened the door fully and started towards the stairs. most likely led to the common room below. I wouldn't go any further if I were you. Vivian spun around at the sound of a voice. Dizzy from the motion, she reached for the wall to steady herself. If only they hadn't drugged her. When her vision cleared, she saw a man stood on the opposite side of her doorway. Well over 6 feet tall, he looked rugged, dangerous, and all too familiar. Dark brown hair hung to his shoulders. His broad chest was covered with a muslin shirt, and dark breeches clung to his muscular thighs. His arms were folded across his chest, and his dark eyes were fixed on her. You took me away from the crowd. I. He raked his hand through his hair, leaving it in disarray. Black stubble covered his strong, square jaw. Why? She asked, unsettled by the disturbing warmth that came to her cheeks. Not that I'm not grateful, but why would you do that? For a stranger? You're no stranger, he replied, his deep voice rumbling in silence that surrounded them. Again, a flash of recognition flared in his eyes. I don't know you. His expression softened. He took a step toward her, and Vivian instinctively backed up. She was too far from the stairs to try to escape, and the effects of the laudanum still slowed her movements. He would overtake her before she reached the first stair. You have nothing to fear from me. He came to stop before her and reached out to touch the sleeve of her gown, never taking his eyes off her. Vivian drew a sharp breath and let it slide through her lungs. Fear wasn't what sent her pulse racing, and yet she could honestly say she was terrified. Who are you? Gwen Douglas. Douglas? A clan from the eastern part of Scotland? So why was he in Kilkerran? She frowned. Your name tells me nothing about who you are or why you helped me. She remembered the crowd closing in on her, heard them accusing her of being a witch. I helped you because you were injured, an injury I caused. She ignored how soft his eyes had gone. You weren't frightened of what the villagers called me? He laughed. Would a witch sacrifice herself for the sake of a child? Her intent was always to help people, as the nuns had helped her after the death of both her father and mother. Today the tables had turned. This man had helped her, and even after William Abbott had called her a witch. Thank you. Your help was unexpected. She scrubbed her hands across the lower half of her arms in a futile attempt to rid herself of a sudden chill that permeated her body. Yet I wonder, why did you do it? Quinn's mouth tipped up to one side in a smile that lived and died in an instant. He moved closer until there was no more than an arm's reach away. I'm not the kind of man to leave a woman to fend for herself in such a situation. His deep voice was impossible to ignore. I'm grateful, she said honestly. Something in her eyes, in his eyes, told her he was not like others. Still, trusting people was dangerous. The hysteria was real. Witch hunters actively pursued women, and even some men. And God helped those who were captured.
Gerri, thank you for those dramatic passages. I loved the book. I loved the especially the adventure aspect of 7 Days with a Scot. I found myself on more than one occasion forgetting to breathe for a moment. I am looking forward to the next installment. Thank you for joining us this evening.
Well, thank you, Wendy and Carl, and best of luck to both of you with your exciting new podcast series.
Oh, thank you. And thank you so much, Gerri, for joining us for a novel talk. I didn't ken how much I'd enjoy reading romance novels until I spent 7 days with a Scot. And to our listeners, thank you for tuning in to our debut episode. Be sure to subscribe so you don't miss any of our future episodes. And for now, keep reading.